this module, we're going to be talking about literature in critical contexts. So we need a few terms to help us understand the way that professionals talk about, write about, and analyze literature. So first of all, let's talk about the difference between literary theory and literary criticism. Some people use these terms interchangeably, and that's not wrong, but we can make a difference between these two that is very useful for our purposes. So when we talk about literary theory and literary criticism, we're going to mean two different things. Literary theory is that philosophy of understanding texts. Oftentimes, literary theories are connected to other disciplines like psychology or linguistics, or even broader social movements like feminism. So theories can stand on their own, almost like a philosophy of understanding. Literary criticism, on the other hand, is the application of one or more literary theories or tools of literary theory to specific texts. So it's the difference between creating the theoretical framework, and that's what theory does, and then actually applying it to real literary primary texts. So that's the difference between theory and criticism for our purposes. Now, when you're examining a theory text or a critical text, it can often be really helpful to understand the structure of that text, especially so that you can target where the significant information is to you in your research if you're thinking about using this text in something that you're writing yourself. So unlike fiction texts that have a full plot, right? Literary texts, nonfiction texts aren't going to have that, but they will have a structure, and it can be helpful to identify whether that structure is inductive or deductive. So a deductive structure is fairly typical for critical articles, in particular literary criticism. And that just means that you start with the main idea. You'll find the thesis up front in the introduction, for example, and then you get the support in the body of the text. This is how we teach you to write when you're learning in a composition class, for example, right? You want your thesis in the introduction and then provide your support. And that's pretty typical for literary criticism. Not always, but that's often where you're going to find that main idea. Inductive, on the other hand, is you build that support first, and then the main idea comes at the end or in the conclusion. So an inductive structure can be more useful when someone, when the writer believes that their audience is going to resist their main idea. It can be persuasive to start with the support first and get people to agree to those smaller support pieces, and then it's harder to disagree with the main idea. You will find an occasional critical article that's inductive, and it's very possible to find theory texts that are structured in an inductive way. Now, one reason that it's good to identify the structure of a text, like in one of these ways, inductive or deductive, is because that's often where you can find that main idea. You want to look at the beginning. If it's not there, you want to check the end, because if you're evaluating a source to see if it's going to be a good source for you to use in support of your argument, you want to get to that main idea quickly so that you can evaluate and see if you want to read more and in more detail. So read the beginning, read the end. Those are good places to start. And if it sounds like an interesting and useful piece, read the middle as well. Okay, now a couple other useful terms. Primary source and secondary source. You probably know these terms already from other research you've done in other fields, but when we're talking about literature, it can be just a little bit tricky because everything is a text. It's not like in science where your primary data might be actual, like performing an experiment and charting data, and then secondary sources are, written texts. When we're studying literature, everything's a written text, so we have to be clear about what's a primary versus a secondary source. So the trick to it is just to think about it this way. Your primary source is a source that is actually under investigation in an article, okay? So when someone's writing about a specific literary text, applying, like criticism, right? Applying a theory to some analysis of a literary text, that literary text that they are analyzing, that is the primary source, okay? So when you're actually investigating whatever literary text you are investigating is going to be your primary source, and it is from that primary source that you will pull evidence, and that's where you pull out direct quotations to support your claims. That's why we use that kind of method in literary studies, because that text is our evidence. So our best evidence for our arguments is to go and get those quotations from the text, strategic, nice, targeted quotations to support the claims that we're making. Secondary sources then are all sorts of other things, right? Other critical articles, historical resources, relevant theoretical texts. There could be, for example, if you're talking about a film as your primary source, maybe reviews of the film would be a secondary source that's used, or an interview with the director. So there are lots of different things that could come into play as secondary sources. I also wanted to remind you what close reading is. And that's just that method of textual analysis that you were just practicing in Unit 2, where you look at specific details of the text and analyze them. So for finding examples of figurative language, for example, and explaining why that's significant to the meaning of the text. So this type of analysis is the basic building block of literary criticism. And you use that, that's how, when you get that evidence out of the text, those quotations, you use close reading to then actually show how those elements of the text are significant. So that's how those things work together. So that just gives us a few terms to help us understand what it is we're seeing and reading as we're reading some literary theory and literary criticism in this module on critical context.